Following the death of Joshua, Israel had no permanent national leadership position. Instead, as threats arise, men and women are raised to leadership for the duration of each crisis. The English term judges does not really capture the role these men and women play in the nation, because we tend to think of a judge as someone sitting passively in a courtroom making decisions. The Hebrew word shopet is usually translated judge, but it means an arbitrator of conflicts, a military commander, a governor of a territory. The judges do settle disputes, but also take responsibility for the military and governmental affairs of the nation in the face of hostile surrounding peoples. To avoid confusion, we will maintain the traditional designation of judge, although the epithet deliverer is probably a more accurate description of these leaders. In the book of Judges, we find an altogether more dismal view of Israel's leaders than in the book of Joshua. Bit by bit, the succession of judges diminishes in quality, until finally leading Israel into utter chaos. The book concludes with stories of rape, murder, and civil war, with the appropriately grim summary statement, "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." Doing right in their own eyes refers to the unrestrained pursuit of looking out for number one. It means the failure to obey God's command. The command is to do what is right in God's eyes, not what seems good in our own biased and self-serving vision. The judges failed to lead the people in observing God's law, and thereby failed both to administer justice and to govern the nation. The book of Judges picks up where Joshua left off, with the failure of Israel to drive out the Canaanite nations in the land. The chief reason Israel was supposed to drive out the Canaanites was to prevent their idolatry from infecting Israel. The idolatry of the Canaanites will test the Israelites' loyalty to God and his covenant. Failing to remove the temptation of the Canaanites, they soon began serving the Canaanite gods, Baal and Astarte. This is not merely a question of occasionally bowing before an image or uttering a prayer to a foreign god. Israel's life is spent in futile service to idols, as they come to believe that their success depends on assuaging the local Canaanite deities. I suppose that raises the question, what is an idol? It's anything that is more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give what only God can give you. A counterfeit God is anything so central and essential in your life that, should you lose it, your life would hardly feel worth living. An idol has such a controlling position in your heart that you can spend most of your passion and energy, your emotional and financial resources on it without a second thought. It can be family and children, or career, making money, achievement, critical acclaim, or saving face and social standing. It can be a romantic relationship, peer approval, competence and skill, secure and comfortable circumstances, your beauty or your brains, a great political or social cause, your morality, virtue, even success in the Christian ministry. After Joshua's death, the tribes of Israel continue their conquest of the southern regions of Canaan, but they are unable to cleanse the land thoroughly of its native inhabitants. God declares that these remaining people will be an impediment to Israel's enjoyment of the Promised Land. Generations pass and the younger Israelites turn away from God, intermarrying with the Canaanites and worshipping local deities. God threatens to abandon Israel because of the disobedience of youth, but he selects a series of judges or rulers to act as temporary leaders for the people. Throughout the lives of these judges, the narrator tells us Israel's behaviour follows a consistent pattern. The people of Israel fall into evil. God sends a leader to save them. And once the judge dies, the people commit even greater evil. The book begins with a royal banquet hosted by a king named Adonibezek. The food is plenteous and varied. In one corner there's a group of 70 men chained up begging for food. They are periodically thrown scraps which they fight over. As they fight and eat it, it becomes obvious that they have no thumbs and no big toes. These are 70 kings who King Adonibezek has conquered in battle. The lack of thumbs meant they could no longer hold a sword. The lack of a big toe meant they couldn't run. They were once proud, royal military leaders, and now disgraced beggars suffering humiliation. Defeated, dethroned, disabled, disgraced. We meet the first judge soon afterwards, a man named Othniel, who was both nephew and son-in-law of Joshua's ally Caleb. Interestingly, he was one of the 12 spies sent to the land of Canaan, but not one who crowned himself in glory like his uncle Caleb and Joshua. King Cushan-Rishathaim is the ruler of the region of Aram-Naharaim, which is part of Mesopotamia. He oppressed the Israelites for 8 years. And that's when God raised Othniel up as the first judge. After the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, Othniel freed the Israelites from King Cushan-Rishathaim, overpowering his forces. The Jews then enjoyed peace for 40 years, until Othniel died. Despite the idol worshipping and other unholy behaviour, God continued to show love and kindness to his people. When they finally cried out to God, he was willing and ready to rescue them. And in the book of Judges, God does this over and over and over again. The name Othniel means the power of God. The passage states, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. We're going to see that sentence repeated over and over in the book of Judges. These courageous judges don't act in their own power. They are only able to prevail over the enemy because the Spirit of the Lord is working through their lives. God uses these judges to set Israel free from bondage. But the power of the Lord is all that they have to conquer. We see this over and over in the book of Judges. When God's Spirit works through his people, the result is always a time of peace. Of course, that peace might have lasted even longer, if only they'd stayed connected to God. Sadly, Othniel's death is the end of Othniel's peace. Judge number 2 is a man called Ehud, which means, where is the glory? After Othniel died and the Israelites fell back into disobedience, the nation were subdued under Elon, the king of Moab. Elon gathered the support of the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and together they captured the Israelite city of Jericho. Once again the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and once again he sent them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin. Ehud was sent with a tribute to Elon. He concealed a small double-edged sword under his clothes, on the right-hand side where he could easily draw it, and where the king's men wouldn't think to check for weapons. That's the significance of him being left-handed. After delivering the Israelites' tribute to King Elon, Ehud dismissed his men and told the king, whom the Bible makes a point of telling us is a very fat man, that he had a secret message for him. In the privacy of the king's upper room, Ehud told Eglon, "I have a message from God for you." He then plunged the sword into the king's belly. We then see the significance of the king's size, as the text gets pretty graphic. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud could not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Ehud escapes from the upper room using the porch, leaving the king's chamber locked from the inside. The servants saw Ehud and assumed the meeting was over, but since the door was locked from within, they assumed the king was using the bathroom. With the king dead, the Israelites launched a surprise attack, killing 10,000 soldiers and conquering Moab. Moab became subject to Israel, and there was peace for 80 years, until Ehud died. In those days, being left-handed was known to be a weakness, or even considered a handicap. But God used the very thing known to be a weakness as his instrument through which he worked to deliver the nation. Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, a long wooden pole with a metal spike used for driving oxen and cattle. While Judges tells us that Shamgar saved Israel, it doesn't tell us he established a period of peace. Interestingly, he was actually a contemporary of the next judge, Deborah, who therefore followed on very quickly. Deborah is one of the better known judges. In fact, along with Samson and Gideon, they are the only 3 judges most people know. She's also probably the holiest or most righteous. The Israelites recognized her wisdom and came to her for counsel and conflict resolution. The military hierarchy recognizes her as supreme commander, and in fact will only go to war on her personal command. Her governance is so good that the land remained at peace for 40 years, a rare occurrence at any point in Israel's history. She is the only judge who is referred to as a prophet or prophetess, indicating that God spoke to her directly. Deborah's service as a prophetess judge suggests that God did not regard women's political, judicial, or military leadership as problematic. It's also evident that her husband, Lapidoth, and her immediate family had no trouble structuring the household so that she had time to fulfill her duties when the Israelites came up to her for judgment. The time of Deborah was another macabre story attached to it, although this time it's not the judge who is the executioner. Deborah told Barak, the commander of the Israelite army, to take the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali to Mount Tabor to conquer King Jabin of Canaan. He said he would only go if Deborah went with him. She then prophesied that the honour of defeating Jabin's army would go to a woman. Israel wins the initial encounter, but Sisera, the leader of the Canaanite army, survives and flees. He turns to Heber for safety, a man whose family were at peace with the Canaanites. Heber's wife, Jair, welcomes Sisera into her tent, gives him some milk, and covers him with a blanket. Sisera then orders Jair to watch over him while he sleeps. But she is sympathetic to the Israelites after years of poor treatment that they had received. So, when he went to sleep, she took a tent peg and drove it through the side of Sisera's head and killed him, hence fulfilling Deborah's prophecy. After Deborah, the quality of the judges begins to decline, while the Israelites regularly faced economic hardship stemming from war. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and so God gave them into the hand of the Midianites for 7 years. The Israelites provided for themselves hiding places in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and Amalekites and the people of the east would camp nearby, destroy the produce and kill their animals. And so once more the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. Israel's economic situation was so precarious under the Midianites that we first meet the future judge Gideon threshing his wheat in a winepress, so that it would be hidden from the Midianites. Gideon is a wonderful example of a paradoxical character of Israel's judges, with very clear examples of both good and bad. Early positivity and spirituality are seen when he destroys his father's idols. Despite the fact that God has promised to be with him, however, Gideon is forever seeking signs, most notably in the incident of the fleece, a hint of the wavering commitment that would ultimately collapse into idolatry at the end of the story. The high point of the tale is, of course, Gideon's mighty triumph over the Midianites. Less well known are his subsequent failures of leadership. The inhabitants of Sukkoth and Penuel refused to help his men after the battle, and his brutal destruction of those cities may feel disproportionate to the offence. Gideon is destroying anyone who crosses him. Despite his protestations that he doesn't want to be king, he becomes a despot in all but name. Even more troubling is his subsequent fall into idolatry. The Israelites were still oppressed by the Midianites. Gideon is called directly by an angel who said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." At that stage, Gideon is far from a mighty warrior. He's hiding from the enemy while doing his chores. The angel continued, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand." Gideon protested the call, arguing that he was the least significant in the poorest family in the weakest tribe in the whole of Israel. But God, through the angel, reassured him as he had reassured his predecessors. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together." Gideon slowly realizes that this is not just an ordinary man he's speaking to, so he gets some bread and meat for an offering. He places the bread and meat on a rock as instructed. The angel touches the rock and the whole thing bursts into flames. At that point, the angel disappears. Gideon, the alleged mighty warrior, is now scared that he shall die for speaking to an angel. But God assures him that he won't. Again, on God's instruction, he tears down his father's false idols, builds a new altar, and sacrifices a bull to Yahweh. The Israelites are unhappy at Gideon's actions and come to kill him, but his father, Joash, defends his son and says if anyone touches his son, they would die. After this, the Midianites attack once again, and Gideon now feels he must fulfill his calling. But he double-checks first. He puts out a sheep's fleece one night and says that if God really wants him to go after the Midianites, to make the fleece wet with dew, but everything around it bone dry. That happens. Although this happens, he decides a triple check is needed. So he puts the fleece out once more that night. This time he asks for the fleece to be dry and everything else to be wet. That happens. Gideon is filled with the Spirit and calls his tribe and neighbouring Israeli tribes together to go and attack the enemy. 32,000 men, which God says is far too many for an attack on a valley full of thousands of Midianites, too numerous to count. So Gideon says to the troops, "If any of you are scared about this operation, so that you're shaking, go home. You won't be needed." 22,000 men left that day. 10,000 are left. still too many to attack the countless Midianites. God has Gideon dismiss another 9,700 more by a test of how they drink from a river. Now Gideon has just 300 men to attack the entire Midianite army. Each man gets a horn and a torch and a clay jar. They surround the Midianites in the middle of the night, break their jars, blow their horns, raise their torches, all at the same time. The Midianites are utterly confused by the noise and the torches. They have no clue what's going on. Those who didn't turn on each other in the confusion ran out into the desert in terror. All the Midianites were caught and killed. Courage isn't fearlessness. It's doing what you know you've got to do, even if you are afraid. The battle is the Lord's. You just have to show up for the fight. Widespread worship of the god Baal continues to plague Israel. And Gideon's son Abimelech serves a violent 3-year reign as Israel's king. His tyrannical reign ends when a woman throws a millstone on his head. The book continues with a series of 6 judges, most of whom few people have ever heard of, and the majority of which only warrant a couple of verses in the book. Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdom. Gideon had 70 sons. Abimelech was the son of Gideon through one of his slaves. When he seized power, he slaughtered 68 of his brothers and half-brothers. One, Jotham, escaped and attempted to seize power for himself and establish a Jewish monarchy. He governed, not judged, Israel for 3 years and fought and killed many Israelites who opposed him. He died fighting against his own people. God then raised up Tola as a judge following the death of Abimelech, and he led Israel for 23 years. Tola was from the tribe of Issachar. Next came Jair of Gilead, who led Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons and rode 30 donkeys. He controlled 30 towns in Gilead. That's all the information we're given about Jair. The most noteworthy of these minor judges is Jephthah, a mighty warrior and the son of a prostitute. His father, Gilead, also had sons through his wife. And Jephthah's half-brothers drove him away to the land of Tob, where Jephthah led a gang of worthless rebels. Jephthah delivered Israel from its enemies, but the story ends in one of the most unforgettable tragedies in the Bible, a tragedy of his own making. Before Jephthah was a judge, the Israelites were basically worshipping any god that wasn't Yahweh. They worshipped Baals, Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab and of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines, but not their own God. The Israelites did eventually cry out to Jehovah, but he said, "You have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen, let them save you when you're in trouble." Jephthah was an outsider. He was different. His father was Jewish and his name was Gilead. His unnamed mother was a prostitute. Jephthah was an outcast and then became an outlaw. Unloved and angry, he became a streetwise kid with a flair for attracting other undesirables to him. Jephthah became the leader of a gang of outcasts in Tob. The story then takes a sharp turn towards God. The land of Gilead was attacked by Ammon, and the best fighter in the clan was needed. That was Jephthah. Jephthah made a living raiding the villages of Ammon. The people wanted a captain. Jephthah wanted a governorship. They wanted Jephthah to make a temporary visit. Jephthah wanted a home. Jephthah uttered his words before the Lord. Jephthah was a God-fearing man with a high sense of justice and fair play. He was a man of his word. He recognized Gilead's problem as a golden opportunity. Others only saw the problem. He recognized the need and the time for change. He had been misbehaving. Though he could not change the past, he could create a new future. Israel fought with the Ammonites, and knowing Jephthah was a mighty warrior, they went to the land of Tob to ask him to lead them, promising to make him the head of Gilead if he agreed. He accepted, and by negotiating with the Ammonite king, attempting to resolve the conflict peacefully. The king refused, and the Israelites began driving the Ammonites out of their land. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he made a foolish and completely unnecessary vow. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. The Lord gave the Ammonites into Jephthah's hand, and the first thing out of Jephthah's house was his only daughter. Jephthah was probably expecting to be greeted by livestock. It was common for them to live in the same space as people. Vowing to make a human sacrifice would have been against the law. But it's possible that Jephthah was so unfamiliar with the Torah that he was willing to sacrifice any human servant. When Jephthah came on the scene, Israel had been giving themselves over to other gods. So he may have simply been treating God like one of them. But whatever he intended, Jephthah definitely hadn't planned on sacrificing his daughter. He basically blames her for the mistake. "Oh, my daughter, you have brought me down and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." She asks for 2 months to mourn, and Jephthah lets her grieve with her friends. After the 2 months she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. The tragedy of Jephthah's sacrifice in many ways overshadows his accomplishments. It inspired an annual tradition in which a young Israelite woman is given leave for 4 days to commemorate. Jephthah led Israel then for 6 years, and when he died, he was buried in Gilead. Judge number 9 is Ibzan of Bethlehem, who led Israel for 7 years. The Bible explicitly states he was a judge, but it gave no record of any battles he fought or enemies he overthrew, nor does it say he saved Israel, as we see with several other judges. Pretty much the only thing we know about Ibzan is that he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and he made a point of marrying all of them to people outside of his tribe. This likely would have helped extend his influence throughout Israel, and might have played a role in creating a period of peace. The next judge is Elon from the tribe of Zebulun. We're told even less information about him. We are told he led Israel for 10 years, that he was buried in Abdom in the land of Zebulun, and that's it. The 11th judge is Abdom, another who we know very little about. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. He led Israel for 8 years and was buried at Pirathon in Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. The final judge is perhaps the most famous of them all, Samson. At the time of his birth, everything is broken. The entire nation is in crisis, and on top of that, there is a family in turmoil. God's people, Israel, have failed spiritually, running after the gods of their neighbours, breaking the laws of the Lord. This spiritual failure led to social upheaval. God allowed the enemy to conquer and oppress them. There follows 40 years of suffering at the hands of the Philistine army. Although God sent this discipline on his people, there is no record of them repenting or calling out to him for help. On top of this national spiritual failure and social upheaval, we meet a couple who struggled with infertility. Manoah and his wife are surrounded by brokenness. For 40 years they know nothing but subjugation and defeat. The present looked as dismal as the past, and there was no glimmer of hope for the future. They couldn't raise a family. There was no one to carry on the family name, to help in their struggle to exist or take care of them in old age. Everything is broken. One day God made it clear to Manoah's wife that she would conceive and give birth to a son. She is thrilled and went into prenatal care mode. These parents sensed their son was going to be special, so they did everything they could to set him apart for God's purposes. The wife had been told by an angel that their boy would be a Nazarite, which was someone who took a vow to be separated for God's use. He was never to cut his hair, never to drink alcohol, not to touch dead bodies, and avoid unclean foods. These outward actions were to reflect his inner dedication. The mother was told their son would save the Israelites from the hand of their enemies. Manoah felt overwhelmed and inadequate to the task. So he turned to the Lord, drawing closer to him than he had ever done before. He prayed, "Lord, please let this man of God whom you sent come again to us to teach us what we are to do with the child who will be born. What is the child's manner of life, and what is his mission?" The husband's request reveals something about the home Samson grew up in. But sadly, then as now, a godly home is no guarantee of a godly life. Samson was a Hebrew with an unusual gift of strength, who must respond properly to the call of God on his life in order to lead his people out of enslavement. He was born in response to prayer, and his parents received 2 visits from the angel of the Lord, giving them special instructions about caring for the child. Samson's parents raised him to be devoted to God. The Spirit of God began to move on Samson as a youth. It was evident to everyone that the Lord had blessed him. Where God gives his blessing, he gives graces for usefulness. Samson was a self-trained soldier of power. He was a mighty man who always worked alone. God prophesied that Samson would begin to deliver Israel. During his life, he never rallied an army or developed a team. But Samson spent too much time in enemy territory. He was attracted to their women, their culture, and their music. Samson thought he could ignore wise counsel, release his rage, forget his vows, and indulge his passion without suffering any consequences. Yet God used Samson to accomplish his final purpose in the final act of his life. The first indication of moral decline comes when he marries a Philistine woman. This is not Delilah, since his love affair comes later. There is no record of him actually marrying Delilah. This is an unnamed Philistine woman from Timnah, and the Bible indicates that the union was God's idea with a view to finding a way for Samson to infiltrate the enemy. Samson's parents do not approve, believing their son should marry from among his own people. At the wedding, Samson sets the Philistines a challenge in the form of a riddle, and it takes his wife less than a week to trick the answer out of Samson. She then told her people they presented the answer to Samson, and Samson had to admit defeat. He gave the Philistines their promised reward, and gave his wife to his best man. By way of recompense for what had happened, his father-in-law offered Samson the wife's younger sister. But Samson took revenge for the stolen romance by tying the tails of 300 foxes together, sticking a torch in the knots, and the foxes ran through the wheat fields and burned all of them to the ground, destroying all of the city's crops. When the Philistines found out who did the damage, they went up and burned his first wife and her father to death. Samson took his revenge by killing more Philistines. After he did this, he ran and hid in a cave outside the city. His actions brought more grief to the Israelites from the Philistines. So they came to Samson and said they were going to hand him over to the Philistines. They tied him up, took him to the enemy, and as he approached, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax. The bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Samson's whole life was a contradiction. He was not only strong in body, but in mind and spirit. He was sharp-witted. He loved riddles. He had a great sense of humour. He was bold before men, but weak before women. He had the Spirit of God upon him. He lived for the appetites of the flesh. He was called upon to declare war upon the enemies of God. Often we find him making friends with the enemies of God. He fought the Lord's battles by day and broke the Lord's commandments by night. At times he soared to incredible heights, but he also sunk to incredible depths. Obviously, Samson's most famous romantic relationship was with the Philistine Delilah. She made it her task to discover the secret of his strength. She kept asking, and he kept lying to her. But each lie is getting closer to the truth. Tie me with green bowstrings, tie me with new ropes, tie my hair in locks. Finally, he caves in and tells her the truth. He breaks the final part of his Nazirite vow. Now it's too late, the point of no return. And the Bible records such a very sad statement when it says, "But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him." He lost his power and didn't even know it. The Philistines took him, put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. Sin binds, sin blinds, and then sin grinds slowly, grinding away at you. At a party, the Philistines called for Samson from the prison and took him to the temple of Dagon, their half-fish, half-man god. They wanted to make sport and mockery of him. They stationed him between the pillars. Samson asked to feel the pillars which support the temple. The temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, while Samson performed. And then Samson called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might. And the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in all of his life. The final chapters of the book portray a fallen people who appear to be beyond the hope of redemption. There is a man named Micah who has lots of money, and his mother uses the money to make an idol. Micah hires a freelancing Levite as his personal priest. Micah believes that the Lord will prosper him because a Levite has become his personal priest, but he's wrong. Some men from the tribe of Dan make off with Micah's whole religious enterprise, including the Levite and the idol. The Levite takes a concubine from a distant village in Bethlehem, but after a domestic quarrel, she returns to her father's house. The Levite goes to Bethlehem to retrieve her. After a 5-day drinking binge with her father, the Levite foolishly begins the journey back home, not long before sunset. They find themselves alone at night in the town square of a village in the tribe of Benjamin. No one will take them in until at last one old man offers the hospitality of a place to stay that night. This rapidly develops into one of the most unpleasant accounts in the entire history of the Israelite people. That night the men of the city surround the house and demand that the old man bring the stranger out so they can rape him. The old man tries to protect the stranger. In order to spare the Levite, the man offers his young daughter and the Levite's concubine for the men to rape instead. They rape them and abuse them through the night until the morning. Their bodies are subsequently dismembered and dispersed to the tribes of Israel, who almost exterminate the tribe of Benjamin. The final line of the book sums up things succinctly. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. No boundaries actually means that you are without protection. In the time of the judges, there were many cycles of sin. Basically, when the people of Israel obeyed God, things went well. When the people of Israel disobeyed God, they experienced personal and national defeat and were judged accordingly. These individual accounts of Israel's judges are vitally important to the early Hebrew culture. The central theme of these tales is heroic struggle, chiefly of marginalized or oppressed people. The Israelites in the book of Judges are strangers in a land they have recently conquered, and they are pressured from all sides by powerful regimes. Israel's judges make manifest the virtues of this marginalized status. Jephthah is the son of a prostitute. The narrator takes pains to note that Ehud is left-handed, and it's this characteristic that enables Ehud to draw his sword and kill the Moabite king by surprise. Even more important than Deborah as a female hero is Jair, who uses the pretense of feminine warmth to draw the great commander into her tent, comforting him before she kills him. The story of Samson may be more appropriately described as an epic, because it is a relatively long story concerning the development of a single extraordinary hero who, it might be said, is a metaphor for the ancient Israel itself. Samson epitomizes some interesting dualities: brute nature against civilized culture, strength against weakness, Hebrew against Philistine. What is unique to this story, and to Judges as a whole, is that, unlike earlier books, the struggle between these opposing forces does not serve to develop irony or reversal. For Samson, the line between these distinctions is blurred. Samson, defined more by his identity as a Nazirite, is a displaced man, roaming back and forth between his home and the Philistines, falling in love with Philistine women, yet terrorizing the Philistines, and eventually suffering betrayal by the Israelites in return. It's only when Samson destroys the temple, crying out, "Let me die with the Philistines," that Israel is saved through Samson's service. The epic of Samson shows that Israel's struggle and its salvation consists less of cleansing foreign influences from the land than of grappling with these influences while remaining faithful to God. The stories in Judges are filled with extreme violence. This violence may cause us to question how God can be good if the greater part of the tribe of Benjamin is killed to make a religious point, or if Jephthah must keep his promise in killing his daughter. One answer is that the abundant violence in Israel is not due to God's wrath, but due to Israel's wickedness. Israel promiscuously worships other gods and insists on returning to evil despite God's help. Furthermore, the tales in Judges begin to develop the notion of sacrifice, the idea that one person's death can be meaningful while another person not, for religious or ethical reasons. Samson's death saves Israel from Philistine persecution. Sisera's death at Jair's hand is a poignant symbol of Israel's victory to be celebrated in song. The writer tells us that the sacrifice of Jephthah's virgin daughter becomes a tradition among the Israelites, an annual celebration of the story by adolescent girls to symbolize the passage from innocence to womanhood. Disobedience always brings judgment. The Israelites present a perfect example of what we are not to do. Instead of learning from experience that God will always punish rebellion against him, they continue to disobey and suffer God's displeasure and discipline. The book of Judges is a testament to God's faithfulness, even when we are faithless. He will remain faithful. Though we may be unfaithful to him, as the Israelites were, still he is faithful to save us, to preserve us, and to forgive us when we seek forgiveness. Keeping his part of the covenant, God would save his people from the oppressors throughout the 480-year span of the book of Judges. If you would like to know more, then please do contact us at any of the contact addresses given on this slide. Or, if you're in the Radstock area one Sunday morning, why not come and join us at the Baptist Church for our 10:30 service? You would always be very welcome.